Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Yusuf Aram. Is China losing ground to the U.S. as Trump ramps up pressure on countries to pick a side? In Panama, Washington may be gaining an edge over Beijing. First, Panama pulled out of China's trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative. Then, a Hong Kong company sold its stake in key ports near the Panama Canal to a U.S.-led consortium. All this came as Trump escalates threats to reclaim the strategic waterway, insisting it was under Chinese influence. So is this the new reality where smaller nations are forced to choose a side? Earlier this month, Trump hiked tariffs on Chinese goods from 10% to 20%, while Beijing retaliated with new counter-tariffs on U.S. agricultural exports. China warned it's ready for any kind of war with the U.S., whether in trade or beyond. Across Asia and Latin America, countries like Panama are feeling the pressure. So where does this leave middle powers like Türkiye? Are they at risk? Or can they find opportunity in this global standoff? Or is there an alternative path where neutrality is still an option? To further break down how complex the world is becoming amidst the growing US-China rivalry, joining me now from Singapore is George Yeo. He's the former foreign minister of Singapore. George, thanks for joining me. Now, for about the past decade, we've been hearing the Americans talk about this Pacific shift, but whether it was the wars triggered during the Arab Spring, whether it's been the war in Ukraine, for some reason or another, the U.S. has been bogged down in Europe or in the Middle East. But it looks like Trump is trying to bring peace to Ukraine, obviously because he does want to secure Europe. But it looks like his secondary motivation is he finally does want to enact some type of Pacific shift and concentrate more on China. What are your thoughts on that? And have the Americans missed the boat on containing China? Is China too powerful to be contained?
Well, I'm not sure if that is American policy to contain China. Of course, if the US could, it would try to, but I don't think it's possible. And the Chinese are taking all precautions. The Trump administration and Trump himself, I think his preoccupation is not external, but internal, that the US body politic is sick, it faces a lot of problems, and it needs fundamental fixing, which is why they've got to improve government, they've got to set aside all these woke causes, which are distracting people, they've got to solve the drug problem, they're trying to restore manufacturing, without which you don't really have military capability. So I think Trump's preoccupations are domestic. But to do that, he needs to cut down external expenditure, put up tariffs so that people invest in the US rather than outsource jobs. And China is a challenge to which the US can only respond effectively if it itself is strong.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned tariffs. When you see these tariffs placed from 10% to 20%, how's that going to impact the Chinese economy? How are the reciprocal steps going to impact the U.S. economy?
I think all these tariff threats are part of negotiation. I think Trump really wants a deal with China. And China is prepared to have a deal with Trump. But they are playing brinksmanship on both sides. But I can say that on the Chinese side, they do not want to escalate. And if they have to compromise a bit more, I believe they will, even though they may not say it. They say it should be 50-50, but I believe they're prepared to go 60-40 or even 70-30 if this will bring about peace and stability.
So you're saying they're looking for some type of grand bargain over multiple sectors and multiple regions, but what would that entail, at least in your opinion? What type of bargain would there be that was initiated by this tariff policy?
No, I think we're entering a very interesting new phase in the world of multipolarity. The Biden administration fought it, thought that the world is not multipolar, that the US is leader. And if it has Europe on its side, it is a clear leader. But the Ukraine war and the Middle East have shown that however hard the US try, the reality of a multipolar world cannot be avoided. And it is interesting that Secretary Rubio himself talks about a multipolar world. And the US is now openly more selfish. It says the international institutions are not important if the US is disadvantaged by their workings. And there's no embarrassment. America first. We look ourselves first. Well, if you look after yourself first, then everybody else will also shed all pretense and look after themselves first. So the actions of the Trump administration will have repercussions, and it will be years before they're fully crystallized.
It does seem like after 3 decades of a unipolar world that the United States has kind of reached the limit of its power, where it's kind of stretching and trying to hold these wars in place, these alliances in place. So for the sake of argument, let's say we've entered or we're about to enter a multipolar world. Where does that leave the middle powers, like, for example, Türkiye or Poland or India or Mexico?
Well, I think Turkey, because of its geographical and historical position, will play a very important role in either stabilizing a large part of Europe and the Middle East, or destabilizing those regions. So the role which Turkey plays will be very important. And it's important for Turkey not just to calculate in its own narrow self-interest, because that is against Turkey's long-term interests. I think Turkey has a powerful interest in greater stability in the region around it, and which means playing an active role in bringing about a ceasefire in Ukraine. I think peace will take much longer, but a working ceasefire, and also in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Another question about Turkey, because it does seem to be one of the more critical middle powers. Do you see it positioning itself more in its traditional role as in the West, or has it now really become neutral, or is it now shifting more towards East? Because it was at the last BRICS summit, it was at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, it's increasing its relationship. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan very recently visiting a trio of Southeastern Asian nations as well. So is this a balancing act, or is this an axis shift?
No, I see Turkey playing all sides, not in an opportunistic way, but because it has influence in all directions. And therefore, by its actions, it can affect local balances and either stabilize regions or destabilize them. Mm-hmm. And Turkey, I believe, will act responsibly because it has the history of being a great power. And geographically, its position is central to a large region. So even if it wants to, it cannot avoid playing a very important role.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about smaller countries too. For example, Panama. Trump saying, hey, there's a lot of Chinese influence on the Panama Canal. We built it. I want it back. And then we quickly see a US-led group purchase stakes in the Panama Canal. So it kind of looked like that pressure worked from a business perspective, leading to that stake transfer. But where does this leave smaller countries like Panama, or, for example, Greenland, which is owned by Denmark, but there's a lot of pressure being placed on Greenland saying, hey, that's important for U.S. national security, and a lot of pressure being placed on the Danish right now.
Well, I think it's difficult for Panama to stand up to U.S. pressures. I was in Panama many years ago when they conducted a referendum on the widening of the canal. And I was asked to speak in favor of it, which I did as Singapore's trade minister. But I also asked one of the officials, I said, have you asked the US whether the widened canal will be wide enough for US aircraft carriers? Because the ability to transfer aircraft carriers between two oceans is of great strategic importance to the US. He said, yes, we asked them. They say it was not necessary. From that exchange, I knew that Panama would always consult the US. So I don't know why Trump made all these threats against Panama, because I believe that on issues which are very important to the US, Panama will, of course, be cooperative. Panama cannot afford not to be cooperative.
Mm-hmm. I want to get into the BRICS, but before that, I want to ask you a question about NATO, because there's obviously been some divide regarding the war in Ukraine and Trump's outreach to Russian President Vladimir Putin, which hasn't gone over well in Europe or with the Ukrainians or with the British either. So are you seeing divides inside of NATO, and how healthy is that alliance going forward?
Well, I believe that under Trump, NATO will be weakened because the North Atlantic Alliance has become transactional. The fact that the US wants Greenland for its own security, rather than trusting that Europe will help the US secure its security, says a lot about the US, and it's a lesson to the Europeans that there's a limit to which they can depend on the Americans. So there's going to be a reaction in Europe. But will this mean the end of NATO or the end of the North Atlantic Alliance? No, I don't think so. I think that the bonds of Western civilization are too profound, and they will continue to act together, but not in the lockstep way, which was the situation in the past.
There's also been talk about a European army, and obviously if something like that's formed, it's going to replace NATO, and it wouldn't have the US, probably won't have Canada either. Can Europe defend itself against threats like Russia?
Well, Europe can't have its own foreign policy, which it needs, if it has no significant military capability of its own. So I think step by step, a European military capability will be built up. It will be part of NATO, but it will be separate from NATO. And in 20 years' time, because we do not know what the world will be like then, Europe will have an option, which it needs to have. And which to have, it must make preparations today.
So you were Singapore's top diplomat. So obviously you had interactions with your EU counterparts on a member state level, but also under the EU umbrella. When you look at that dialogue that you had with EU bureaucrats, how much was it reflective of US policy, and how much did you feel that the EU actually had its own strategic autonomy when dealing with you?
On economic matters, there was no doubt. But on military, geostrategic matters, I think Europe was and remains and will continue to depend much on the US. So the more Russia is an enemy, a threat to Europe, the more Europe will need the US. But Trump wants to settle the Russians over Ukraine. And suddenly the Europeans find themselves out on the limb because their position on Russia, without American backing, cannot be sustained. So I see a very painful readjustment in the common European position. And in the end, Europe has to live with Russia, Russia has to live with Europe, just as Russia has to live with Turkey and Europe has to live with Turkey.
Oh, tough neighborhood. The BRICS. Now, it looks like Trump has definitely identified the BRICS as a challenge, concerned about de-dollarization, concerned that the BRICS can form their own currency. Now, ever since its creation, the BRICS has been growing in influence in the number of members. The latest summit in Kazan, I had attended, and it looked like a record number of participants at that summit. But with Trump identifying them as a challenge, maybe an adversary, we'll have to see how his rhetoric continues going forward. Is that something that could stop the BRICS from growing, create concern amongst members, or do you think the BRICS are now on a path of no return forward?
No. The growth of BRICS is a response to the West acting unilaterally. Not very long ago, we had the global financial crisis, and the G7 could not generate sufficient global demand. So George Bush convened the first G20 summit in 2008. And in 2009, Gordon Brown convened the second in London. And then the G20 countries agreed to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy and shorten what would otherwise have been a prolonged global downturn. But since then, the G20 has been rendered ineffective, partly because of the Ukraine war, and partly because the US and the other G7 countries thought that they could assert a primary position. Now, BRICS growth is in response to this unilateralism. And Russia, of course, wants it to grow legs because of the sanctions that it faces. But countries like China, India, and Brazil, they say, no, let's play this slowly. If the G7 continues to act unilaterally, then we will have to create a countervailing force. So up to today, the G20 has no secretariat. It only has a steering committee. Mm-hmm. And it talks about many things, but it has not yet moved towards implementation or in the direction of implementation. So it is a warning to the West that if you act unilaterally, then do not criticize us for responding.
Okay, but
so I don't see.
Is Trump's recent threats, where he talked about placing tariffs on BRIC members that would move towards de-dollarization, do you view that as a deterrent where BRICS members will be like, oh my God, I don't want tariffs, let's slow down? Or is that a catalyst where BRICS members are like, this is the moment why we formed the BRICS actually, for actions like this, and make them fast forward, move quicker?
I see Trump's threat as a sign of weakness, because if you have to threaten people to use the US currency, something is wrong. People should use the US currency because it is the most convenient, it is the cheapest, it is the most reliable. But if you have to threaten them that you must use it or else, then it shows the beginning of a decline, which is what Trump worries about. Because once the US dollar loses its reserve status and its advantage of seniorage, what once upon a time was called the exorbitant privilege, then the US economy would be in deep trouble, and the US ability to finance hundreds of military bases around the world will be jeopardized. So I think he made the threat because he's worried. The BRICS countries say, look, no, we won't make this move unless you are unreasonable. So I believe that the pressures are now in the right places.
How close are we to seeing the US dollar being ditched as the reserve currency? Are we going to see a BRICS currency very soon, or will the Chinese yuan, for example, gain more convertible in structure and become the next reserve currency? How do you see that playing out?
No, I don't see the US dollar's position as a reserve currency being lost anytime in the near future. But there's no doubt that the renminbi will become more and more important. But the renminbi cannot displace the US dollar because I don't believe China will ever allow its capital markets to be fully open. There are many more renminbi circulating in China than there are circulating outside China. If China opens up capital markets, then its own financial system can be manipulated by London and New York, which the Chinese do not want. So because of that, there's a limit to which the renminbi can play its role as a reserve currency. But it will be a significant reserve currency. And the US will weaken relatively. The US dollar will weaken relatively. One hopes that the euro will strengthen relatively. So we're entering a period where the financial markets are messier, where there's no one dominant currency, where gold will be insurance for a lot of people, which is the reason why gold prices have been going up. In a sense, we are returning to history, because for most of human history, the financial system of exchange in the world has been messy. It will become like that again.
I want to ask you a little about the Russia-China relationship, obviously growing closer and closer, with both countries being sanctioned by the United States. And then there was this understanding probably over the past decade or so that the United States needs to drive a wedge between Russia and China. How do you see the bilateral between Moscow and Beijing playing out in the future? And Is peace in Ukraine kind of an initiative to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing?
Well, of course, that is what the US and indeed what the entire West would like, to drive a wedge between Russia and China. But both Russia and China know that. And they're taking care to keep each other informed, to ensure that the trust that they've built up over the years will not be broken. So everybody is playing a multipolar game. And it is right for the US, in its own self-interest, to move closer to everybody. This was Henry Kissinger's advice. The US should move closer to Russia, to China, to Europe, to India, to everybody, so that on any important issue, the US plays a critical balancing role. Now, this was something which the Biden administration did not understand or did not want. It wanted to be dominant, and so it exhausted itself. I think Trump's game will be more effective, more subtle, but more effective. Unfortunately, the manner in which he negotiates is sometimes too dramatic for our taste.
I want to ask you a little about these trade routes, because they're becoming very, very important. Obviously, Belt and Road Initiative, China's landmark trade route project that they've had. The Turks have the middle corridor with the Turkic nations, obviously very important, also linking up China to European markets. We've heard about the India-Middle East corridor, but that seems to have taken a back seat. Have the Americans and the Europeans come too late in the game to this rivalry of trade corridors? How has the Belt and Road Initiative kind of established itself as the premier trade route going forward?
No, the Belt and Road is part of a historical phenomenon when China becomes a very important market, and other countries want to access that market to derive advantage from it. And that's how the China trades of the history, the Silk Routes of history, have developed. And to facilitate such trade networks, infrastructural plans, master plans should be coordinated, and facilities are required. So there's nothing exceptional about the Belt and Road. It is the result of the growth of the Chinese economy and many countries in the world wanting to access that economy and to build infrastructure more cheaply.
George, one last question. I'm running out of time, but I want to ask you about Taiwan. Many U.S. presidents saying they respect the one China policy. But at the same time, you see senators, congressmen, different instruments, let's say, of the American bureaucracy visiting Taiwan. Obviously, Beijing viewing these as escalatory visits. How do you see the relationship between the U.S. and China vis-a-vis Taiwan playing out? Is that an issue that the Americans are going to continue to press on as a flashpoint going forward?
I think many American and some European politicians think that Taiwan is a good issue to poke China with, to irritate China. They think it costs them nothing. So the Chinese response is, no, it will cost you something. If you think you can use Taiwan to poke us, we will impose a cost, and you will feel it. And then these countries, especially the smaller ones, will make the adjustment. Trump knows that the Chinese has a very clear red line on Taiwan, and which is why, because he wants a larger deal with China, he's not playing Taiwan. And the Chinese would much prefer peaceful reunification, because these are fellow Chinese people. Why do they want to kill fellow Chinese? And with every year, their relative strength to the Taiwanese and to the Americans around the Taiwan area improves. So China can afford to wait and wait for the fruit to ripen. If they pluck it, it'll be a sour fruit. I think they're waiting and they're patient. But if other powers think that they can play Taiwan, China will take care to inflict upon them a cost. It will cost China too, but it will cost the other party.
George Yeo, Singapore's former top diplomat, thanks for that enlightening conversation. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Yusuf Aram. If you got any comments, please share them with us on X at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find more exclusive content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.